My name is Shreya, and I'm Head of Research Initiatives here at the Mellon Center. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the center today. This, as you can see, is an intimate gathering. Thank you for being here. We are here today to honor the legacy of the late art historian Natasha Eaton, who was involved with many projects at the center over the years, and whose sparkling insight has left indelible traces on the ways we think about British and South Asian art history and the world more broadly. We feel very lucky to have Professor Chris Pinney here to deliver a lecture in Natasha's memory, titled Photo State, Experiments in Eaton-escence. The lecture comes to Pinney's own adventures in rural India and South Asian photo studios with the wider illumination and brilliance of Natasha's distinctive approach. I know that for most of us in the room, Chris Pinney needs no introduction. I will, though, do a short intro. So Christopher Pinney is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and Visual Culture at University College London. He has held visiting positions across the world in Australia, the United States, South Africa, Turkey, and Poland. His research interests cover the art and visual culture of South Asia, with a particular focus on the history of photography and chromolithography in India. So he's also worked on industrial labor and Dalit goddess possession. Among his publications, which have had an immense impact on my work, and I know and that is the case for most of you in this room, are Camera Indica, Photos of the Gods, The Coming of Photography in India, Photography and Anthropology, The Waterless Sea, and Lessons from Hell. As part of the Photo Demos collective, he published Citizens of Photography, The Camera and the Political Imagination. Without further ado, over to Chris.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. I feel it's a great honour to be able to offer a tribute to Natasha. What follows is intended as a heartfelt tribute to Natasha. It presents 12 fragments of radically different length from an already fragmentary text, Photo State, which I hope will make her smile out of recognition and the affirmation in her own work of what she saw as the utopian alternative regime of value to be found in the bazaar, the shrine, and the Nawabi court. Natasha's work is characterized by a fascination with images, not as fixed outcomes of lineages or identities, but rather as volatile, unruly migrants, translational vectors whose material stickiness produces not a fixity of place, but a continual movement as it fuses with something else that crosses its path. It is these qualities that I seek to affirm. I attempt periodically to confront my own relatively conventional conceptualisations and explorations in bazaars, shrines, and Nawabi centres such as Lucknow, but also in rural India and South Asian photo studios, with the wilder illumination and brilliance of Natasha's distinctive approach. Earlier this afternoon, when we heard wonderful series of tributes and engagements with her work, I had cause to comment that reading her grant proposals and her work more generally always left me feeling rather quaint and archaic. I had a feeling that the next generation was racing ahead, leading the old guys bewildered in their wake. Okay, so there are 12 sections, and the first section is called Photo State. One scorching afternoon in 2018, I set out for Nai Sarak in Old Delhi. As usual, the journey there from Ramnagar, a few kilometres away, had taken about an hour, my auto rickshaw stuttering to a halt in the congestion approaching Chandni Chowk. Dismounting by the Jain bird hospital, where in the 1990s I'd gotten myself photographed by one of the few remaining box camera wallahs, I savoured the bustle and energy. I wandered past the front of New Gramophone House, where I'd purchased so many remarkable early 78 RPM records of songs from films, including Awara and Mother India. Next was Dariba Gully, where photographic supply shops still sold hand-painted studio backdrops. And then I pressed on past the Gurudwara and turned left into the relative cool of Nai Sarak, heading for the southern section where dozens of calendar retailers were stocking up for their pre-Diwali frenzy. Then on my right, in a tiny passageway that served as a shop front, I glimpsed a hand-painted sign that seemed to say photo state. The heavily serifed and irregularly spaced lettering was a fine example of what Botnick and Raja eulogize as subtle technology. Beneath the sign was an ancient typewriter and a battered photocopier. Both looked decades past serviceability, but were clearly still viable and in use. As Sudhir Mahadevan observed, quote, "No technology dies a predictable death in India." In his memorable phrase, "There is an obviation of obsolescence." There was no one in the shop, so I waited and gazed at this profound tableau, feeling conflustrated by this defamation of the photocopying service into a name that so perfectly described my decades-long fascination with the ways in which the camera has been embraced by Indians. State conjured both the territory of India, that has been my chief interest, and the condition or manner of existing that photography engenders. Photo state also exemplifies the zone which so interested Natasha, what in mimesis across empires she offers as a utopian alternative to bourgeois modernity, in which she characterized as the regime of value established in the shrine, the bazaar, and the Nawabi court. It is these locations with which the rest of this talk engages. Next section is called Positively in a Certain Shape. It is one of those photographs that seems to occupy the wrong time. On a first casual glance, you might imagine it was made in the late 1920s or 30s, but as is often the case, evidence of its actual date comes as a surprise. 26 June 1952 is the rubber stamp below the name of the maker, Mahananda Studio, Madurai. The artful arrangement of a group of men in two informal rows is testimony to the photographer's skill in dealing with large groups of sitters. The figures are arranged in a pleasing open formation, and the photographer has clearly directed the sitters how best to arrange their hands and arms. There are 10 adult males, all dressed in South Indian white shirts and lungis, and one younger boy at the left. Conversely, we might say there are 10 figures still present as the camera caught them, and one figure who's been subject to a furious defacement, a scratchy blue pen having been wielded in an attempt to obscure the presence of the figure at the far right. What actions could have caused such offence? Perhaps these are 10 office workers with their young peon, their assistant, and the figure in blue was found to have embezzled the firm. Perhaps he was found guilty of adultery, perhaps having cuckolded the wielder of the pen. Perhaps the figure in blue contravened his caste's strict dietary protocols and was made an outcast. Whatever his crime, he was not alone. A Bombay studio image scanned from a glass negative exhibits the same vigorous defacement, the iconoclast fury being viscerally indexed by the energetic scrawls that obscure both faces of a couple. Yet the technique is different. If the Madurai defacer sought an impossible removal from the scene of photographic presence, the Bombay iconoclast seeks not oblivion, but some sort of highly visible injury on the faces of those who remain recognizable. As with other iconoclashes, the attempt to destroy instead creates, or as Natasha, who was fascinated by defacement, puts it, the iconoclastic hammer strikes sideways. Next section is called Tablet. 19th January 2017, as frequently happens, villagers proffer images of past events or deceased relatives for re-photography. Gordon Lal Babilal produces an image of him and his wife seated before the main Chamunda goddess image at a shrine in Nagda. It is perhaps 20 years old and is framed in rusted tin with a glass front. Its shape, size and weight is remarkably like a tablet, say a larger Samsung of the kind which are popular with richer locals. Gordon Lal offers it to my camera, classed in the same way that the day before Pratik Punjabi, the son of a leading local photographer, had held a shiny tablet for me to view an opulent pre-wedding shoot made at an upscale resort on the banks of the river Narmada. Next section is called Photography in an Expanded Field. In November 2012, a Jain guru, Rishabh Chandra Surji, who spurned motorised transport, visited Batasura village, pushed all the way from Nagda Junction in an elaborate handcart by enthusiastic devotees. He was feted on his arrival, blessed a warehouse owned by one of the Jains, took tea and read a newspaper in the centre of the village, and then evaluated the dynamics of the village puja room using a Vastu sacred space app on his mobile phone. Towards the end of his visit, 10 Pagliaji, or Paunki Nishan, were made. These were footprints permanently recorded on small sheets of cotton after the Guru's feet had been dipped in a bowl of saffron water. Following this, the images were dusted with vashkep, a sandalwood powder that had been blessed by the Guru. These puglia were imprints of the Guru, indexes of his presence, and were treated with profound reverence as they were distributed as holy relics. They were what Natasha might have referred to as vernicles, i.e. icons associated with Saint Veronica, which show her holding the world's earliest photograph, an image of Christ on a veil with which he washed his face. Throughout, many of the devotees took photographs of the prints with small digital cameras, as though these modern devices could pay homage to this foundational moment of mimesis. At the close of proceedings, the Jain host soaked the Guru's feet in the water and then pressed them to his head in a gesture of subordination, Charan Raj. The whole encounter, laying bare as it did the mechanics of transmission, seemed to present in almost mythic form a parable of representation and authority, and what Natasha liked to call the magical contract of photography. Next section is called Cool Photography. Perhaps situating photography in this expanded field should also involve an appreciation of its thermal properties. There is straight photography, pictorial, studio, documentary, and many other ways of describing and dividing photography as a practice. Sometimes photographs will be categorized as cool or hot, but usually this is intended metaphorically. The image stuck with electrical tape to the door of Raghunath's Samsung fridge suggests that a literal interpretation would be more appropriate. The photograph on the fridge is roughly inscribed at the top in Devanagari, Om Namah Shivaya, an invocation of the god Shiv, and documents Raghunath firewalking during the festival of Holi. Despite the egalitarian ideology of Holi, when it is claimed that everyone becomes one, several caste-specific bonfires are lit at dawn on the morning of the first lunar day of the month of Chaitra, this marking a period of 7 days leading up to Shitla Saptami, Shitla's 7th, during which only cooling foods are prepared and eaten, and water is poured over the stones that littered the old Shitla shrine. Then follows a bhang-fueled carnival in which colour is thrown, or rather violently applied, to the faces and bodies of relatives, friends and neighbours, And earlier today we saw a great photo of this used as the cover to Natasha's colour book. The heat of midday and the exertions of the morning encourage a lull in proceedings until the afternoon's main event, traversing a trench filled with glowing charcoal in a collective effort to contain the thermal and cosmomoral heat of the coming hot season. Known as a chul in the village I'm familiar with, the trench is usually about 4 feet wide and 15 feet long, although claims are always made about neighbouring villages where supposedly the chul is 40 feet long. Significantly, it is dug directly outside the shrine to Shitla, the cool one, goddess of smallpox, besides the new Shiv shrine. Prospective firewalkers disappear to purify themselves in wells and tanks on the periphery of the village, while preparations continue at the chul. As the embers burn down, the Shiv temple priest fans the flames with large sprigs of neem leaves and pours donated ghee onto the fire. Neem is considered very cooling, its shade being prized on hot days by exhausted travellers. We could do with some neem today. The firewalkers emerge from the surrounding terrain, forming a long line, each person bearing a kalash, a brass pot filled with water and topped with mango leaves, that they decant over the shivling near the Shitla shrine. Then, along with Raghunath, they traverse the fiery chul. He was photographed on a fellow villager's phone as he walks barefoot, slowly towards the end of the fire pit. I'm not sure how clear it is in this image. A line of younger villagers patiently files behind as they all undergo this public demonstration of internal tranquility and placidity. There are two local theories that explain how this is all possible. One is expended by the higher caste grouping in the village, Jains and Mukatis in particular. This stresses Krishna's cooling power. It is the ghee, the clarified butter, they argued, which releases heat from the cinders, and ghee is intimately associated with Krishna as a cooling and imperishable product of the cattle which Krishna preserves. For Rajputs and castes lower in the local hierarchy, like Raghunath, however, the firewalking is made possible because the participants, like the god Shiv, mobilize their internal heat to conquer the heat of the chul. It is a model of thermal exchange that also lies at the heart of refrigeration technology. Raghunath, prevented from birth from sharing his complex cosmological thoughts, for he is both non-verbal and deaf, seems to be using photography and his domestic appliances to communicate clearly. Natasha, I feel, would have enjoyed this literally sticky image. Next section is called Nazar and Darshan. It's not only that photography is entangled in thermal exchanges. We need to also consider the material and embodied landscape in which vision operates and in which images exert their power. Firstly, consider an elaborate practice that I witnessed in a rural household in central India in 2012. It's called Nazar Utarna, or the removal of the evil eye, and is a procedure that's deployed whenever anyone in the household is affected by the evil eye. I realise here that I sound like a modern incarnation of Edgar Thurston, writing in 1912. Natasha was pretty much obsessed with Edgar Thurston, so I'll take the compliment if indeed it's offered as such. In the case of this particular household, which was 4 members, this is about twice per year, the person afflicted with nazar, the patient, sits before the healer. In this case, the healer was the patient's father, but elsewhere it's likely to be a Brahmin priest or Dalit shaman, a Gola, who performs this procedure. The healer prepares a 1-foot-long wick made from raw cotton, which is then soaked in ghee. This is then placed in front of the head of the patient 7 times before being tied to a short stick and allowed to hang vertically over a small water pot, a lota, that is placed directly in front of the patient. The wick is then ignited, and as it burns, with the accompaniments of much hissing and spluttering, drops of burning ghee regularly drop into the water pot below, where an accumulated slick of soot starts to gather. This material process visualizes the transference of the physical presence of nazar into the water pot, the relocation of nazar from the body of the afflicted onto the surface of the water. It recalls the common anti-nazar phrase to be seen throughout North India, which declares Buri nazar wale tere muh kala. Evil nazar person, your mouth will go black. Except that in nazar utarna, it is a kind of watery eye that turns black. The Buri nazar wale slogan is often written on the back of vehicles, from which may hang a shoe or a totka, a lime with green chilies on a thread, but will more commonly display the grimacing face of a demon or an apotropaic spot pattern. The demon's face and the vibrant dancing spots are intended to deflect the malevolent extra-transmissive vision of the Nazarwale. This vertiginous exchange of form makes me think of the endless transformations that appear in Natasha's work. Shark charmers who turn into telegraph poles that turn into pebbles, and shells that blur the boundaries between mouth and ear. The next section is called on the category of the demotic. Some popular photographic practices are doubtless best described as vernacular. If Pierre Bourdieu's analysis can be trusted, then 1960s French popular photography perhaps qualifies, although he nuances his description by pointing to a pervasive, naturalistic, popular aesthetic. He chiefly emphasizes the position photographic practices occupy within hierarchies of taste. As he puts it, barbarous taste is never entirely free of all reference to good taste. Popular practices, in other words, are reactions to dominant practices. The demotic, following J.F. Champollion, who elaborated this concept in his engagement with the Rosetta Stone in 1822, denotes a ground-up practice of the people rather than the reactive top-down trajectory of theories of vernacularity. Demotic assumes a widespread subaltern practice, which is more than local and less than global, while vernacular, based on linguistic models, assumes popular practices which are reactive to dominant hierarchies. The linguistic paradigm of vernacularization involves a distilling out of local idioms from much larger cosmopolitan structures, or as the Sanskritist Sheldon Pollock puts it, in conscious opposition to some larger world in relationship to which they choose to speak more locally. Pollock contrasts vernacular place with cosmopolitan space, describing vernacularization as choosing, quote, to write in a language that did not travel as easily and as far as the well-traveled language of the older cosmopolitan order. It is apparent how models of vernacularization applied to media suit a rather conventional mode of anthropology, invested in emphasizing localization as active cultural practice. It affirms the heroic estimation of the human subject, who always proves capable of overcoming the potential tyranny of technology and unwittingly feeds ex-nominating narratives through its celebration of divergent local appropriations. Demotic seems a better description than vernacular for much of the popular practice encountered in India for two central reasons. Firstly, a good deal of popular photography reveals a desire to engage with, rather than withdraw from, the cosmopolitan. Telephones, cityscapes, motorbikes, airplanes, or here radios, are all symptoms of a modernity and mobility that connects rather than disconnects localities. This mélange of speed, glamour, consumption and aspiration forms the repertoire of much global popular photography. Secondly, much global popular photography looks very similar. This is the more than local, less than global space of the demotic, a distributed horizontal space of popular practice, whose dynamic space is quite different from the vertical space of the vernacular. Next related section is called Modern Studio. Photography offers a device for encroaching on what is yet to be, a space for imagining and enacting a future, a zone for the performance of new hybrid identities through enmeshing the subject of portraiture with technological artifacts such as bicycles, planes, motorbikes, radios and telephones. The subjunctive becomes in an instant the proleptic. As Karen Strassler writes of Javanese practices, quote, the studio portrait's charge emerges from its marriage of the possible, this might be, to the actual, this has been. But the material repertoires that inform these local iconographies of modernity repay study, for they are not simply signs of progress at the level of consumption. Unlike in Philip Apagya's Ghanaian studio, Indians have no visible desire to be pictured with fridges, washing machines or shiny bathrooms. The modernity that is invoked in South Asian studios is not that of affluence or success per se, but is rather connectivity, speed and transmission. James Siegel serves as a good guide here. Writing about photography in the colonial East Indies, he argued that, quote, photography emblematized the pervasive fantasy of a lingua franca that would offer perfect translatability and open transmission, a medium ideally suited for a new orientation to the globalized world of modernity and away from closed boundaries, rigid hierarchies and fixed identities. We could say that photography provides a medium through which all these various prostheses, bike, radio, telephone, television, etc., are united. But we should also note that all these technological artifacts involve a mobility and liquidity, physical movement across distance and through space, and transmission of sound and image. It is in this context that a late 1970s Madhya Pradeshi swag studio montage from a wedding album showing the groom erupting from a film canister seems simultaneously archaic and foresighted. Analog film through this imaginative presentation seems to preempt not only the procession of simulacra whose egalitarian nature Natasha often celebrated. This image also seems to perfectly capture the explosive nature of Natasha's thinking about the visual. Next section is called An Accelerating Aura. The observation that the proliferation of photography in India has encouraged the production of more rather than less aura has to be the starting point rather than the conclusion of any account of media history in the subcontinent. Walter Benjamin, in his optimistic Marxist incarnation, had predicted that photography's exhibition value would erode the image's cultic value. Natasha was definitely interested in the persistence of the cultic. Benjamin's account is understandably monotheistic. Its entire causative and explanatory logic is grounded in an assumption of singular origins in which the cultic, the authentic, and the hierarchical find their ground zero. The early missionary fear of proliferating Hindu images was not driven by a simple misrepresentation. Despite attempts by Hindu reformers such as Ram Mohan Roy to monotheize their religion, most Hindu practice continues to affirm an originary multiplicity, which technological reproduction mirrors rather than subverts. An early montage print produced by Suresh Punjabi of Swag Studio in the late 1970s features multiple appearances of his brother Mahesh who is his go-to model. At one level, it is a demonstration of virtuoso printing techniques achieved in very basic conditions by a new studio keen to make its name. But it is also illuminated by the Indologist Betty Hyman's use of the metaphor of a crystal to describe the Hindu worldview. Quote, "Whatever man sees, he has seen or will see, is just one facet only of a crystal. Each of these facets from its due angle provides a correct viewpoint, but none of them alone gives a true all-comprehensive picture." Benjamin's fundamental assumptions about images, origins and authenticity arise from what the Egyptologist Jan Assmann describes as the Mosaic distinction. It was Akhenaten, the pharaoh of the 18th dynasty about 2,700 years ago, who tried to end cosmotheism, a world of endless overlapping images. Akhenaten attempted unsuccessfully, thank goodness, to overthrow polytheism, to put a stop to a proliferation of gods and images through the imposition of monotheism. He was the inventor of what Assmann calls the world's first counter-religion, the source of the idea that images were a betrayal of something purer and less visible. What he attempted to destroy was a world of promiscuous images, of a respect for the visible, where it was assumed that different communities had arrived at their own slightly different visions that were all ultimately exchangeable. What Assmann called techniques of translation created an ecumen of interconnected nations. Indeed, Benjamin's utopian yearning for a comprehensive liquidation of the privileging of the original might be seen as both embodying the legacy of the Mosaic distinction and also as a deep aspiration to transcend it and participate in a similar ecumen. Natasha's work can be seen as a re-energization of this cosmotheistic potential. Next section, I think we've got 3 to go, is called Inverting the Lens. In North India, there is a strong connection rooted in the Sanskrit prefix prati between the representational and political. Among the denotations and connotations of prati are copy, print, likeness, comparison, repetition, continuity, towards, against, and in opposition to. It is suggestive of a double-facing mirror that signifies mimetic reflection, but also opposition and destruction. Some Indian objects dramatize this reversibility in unforgettable ways. Consider the Jain Hawa Murti, or air statue. Usually only to be found in temples, these heavy brass artifacts. I'm afraid mine was too heavy to bring on a hot day like this to show you. These heavy brass artifacts present a cutout of Mahavir, a powerful depiction of presence through a figure ground reversal. So they're a brass outline where the outline is the cutout. The presence is the absence of Mahavir. It's a genius artwork. It's a tool for extraordinary thought, for amazing contemplation. Mahavir's transcendence, renunciation and power is conjured by presenting what he is not. That is, the surrounding contours of his missing body. Equally instructive are mirrored images of deities that are still common in rural central India. Usually the product of artisanal work in pilgrimage centres, these prints place elements of commercially printed images of gods behind a mirrored surface. Parts of the print are excised and the remaining elements form templates for areas on the mirrored surface where the tain is removed. The desired end result is a palimpsest of printed images of the divine and plain mirrored surface. The final effect is that when the beholder pays homage to the god, she sees herself adjacent to the deity in a perfect exemplification of the mechanism of darshan, in which the devotee looks at the god who also sees them. This also recalls the remarkable mirror story in Nizami's Iskandar Nam, with which Natasha opens mimesis across empires. I reflected on the reversible, or more properly invertible, nature of representation one blisteringly hot day in a rather desolate field known as Duntalab, about 2 kilometres from the village of Batsura. Duntalab, a mango tree in the middle of nowhere, is where the priest Ram Maharaj thrashes. It becomes possessed, sometimes as frequently as every 2 weeks. Though an exceptionally bleak location, especially in the summer, remarkable events unfold here, and pilgrims travel great distances to participate. Duntalab is a place I always associate with the burning heat of the brain-fryingly cruel variety. The flatness of the terrain and the white light make your eyes shrivel, and once you reach the Sagas's chosen spot, there is minimal shade. I try and pack 3 litres of water to see me through each jatra. Ram Maharaj's jatra, or choki, involves manifesting successively as 5 different sagas, archetypally the spirits of warriors decapitated in battle, also known as Juja in parts of Rajasthan. They all smoke cigarettes except Ambevale, the head sagas, who smokes ganja in the chillum. The other sagases will smoke any cigarette. They don't have brand preferences and are usually offered the cheapest, so one called Midlands. All the action unfolds under the mango tree. Ram Maharaj removes his battered pugri, turban, and swathes himself in a thick blanket, indifferent to the insufferable heat. He starts to twitch and utters a standard vocalization of impending possession. Ahim! This functions as a dramatic stage direction, presaging the onset of thrashing and the switch between the identities of different sagases. Meanwhile, the sagases' needs have been attended to. They are offered their chillum and cigarettes, and incense sticks are lit, agabati. Soon the area at the foot of the mango tree acquires the look of a First World War battlefield, a mini Passchendaele wreathed in the smoke of battle. Then the logic of prati starts to make itself felt. Maybe it is the heat, maybe the starkness of the location, maybe the manner in which I'm using my camera, but I suddenly have the sense of being trapped in a Rabinowian, i.e. Following Paul Rabinow's definition of externality. So the sense of being trapped in a Rabinowian externality as a distantiated spectator looking at the sagas. Until this point, my apprehension of the sagas as representation had simply involved a unidirectional act of looking. What did they look like to me? But this, I realised, was not enough. And perhaps I heard Natasha whispering in my ear that the logic of darshan demanded that I close the gap and try and see what it was they saw. Using my camera lens as prosthesis, I positioned it to mimic the eyes of the sagas, trying to capture what it was like down at ground level, surrounded by the stubbly goat-eaten vegetation, breathing the perfume of ganja and tobacco, the hazy outlines of human devotees just visible on the horizon. Next section is called Sufi Light. Oh, sorry, we had another slide of the Sagas's view. I suppose that I was still in search of some kind of nomination, some visual tehzeeb, some ethnographic booty to salvage from my fieldwork, something like the allure of the Muslim court that so enchanted Natasha. I was in Lucknow, North India in 2018 and trying to get to know the workers in a cluster of a half-dozen photo studios in Aminabad, in the old part, or one of the old parts of the city. Despite the vengeful destruction wreaked on the city by the British in the wake of the 1857 rebellion, much of the glory of Oud endures, and the old centre of the city, Husainabad, presents a bejewelled skyline comprising the big and little imambaras and the two fine gateways, the largest of which is Rumi Darwaza. During research in the city in 2018 and 2019, I was struck by the sense of Awadhi architecture as a beautiful facade of buildings turned into pictures, structures made to be seen as much as lived in. But there is a striking absence. In the Euro-American imagination, Lucknow conjures the work of early photographers, Felice Beato, Samuel Bourne, and others. Beato obviously was a huge interest of Natasha's. It is a city that endures in a sepia imagination, and yet in contemporary Lucknow, there is zero presence of that sepia stripe. This is borrowing Adorno's notion of the radio stripe, the continual chatter of radio in the background, or the sepia stripe that one does often encounter in cities. So zero presence of that sepia stripe. No postcards, no calendar images, no posters. Of the many cities that Lucknow has since become, it is the new ones, the capital of India's most populous state, the Dalit monumentalism of Ambedkar Park that dominate. The one space where Awad, Oud, the old Shia Lucknow, which so fascinated Natasha, met the camera in contemporary Lucknow, was a fast-reducing one. I recalled a much earlier visit to the Bara Imam Bara, maybe circa 2005, and seeing a small desk display under the interior of interior arch of a photographer, a Mr. Raza. The desk was covered with a sheet of glass under which assorted photographs were displayed, including several recording the visit of the film and stage actor Om Puri. In October 2019, Mr. Raza was still plying his trade, as he had for the last 42 years, but only just. Tizib was the fabled old Lucknow etiquette, which many people complained was being destroyed by the new brutal conurbation of rural migrants that was replacing the old city. Maybe it was there in the requests often made that I should not copy old photographs of female Muslim clients that were displayed within studios, and sometimes perceptible in the polished politeness of Sudeep, the proprietor of Student Photo, and the courteous professionalism of Baba, their striking chief studio photographer. I'd asked many local photo studios to produce images that featured Awadhi Lucknow. I'd attached a few adjectives and clues in my commission: paramparik, traditional, itihasic, historical, and so on, in the hope that this would precipitate visual tehzeeb. Most of the resulting photographs were unimaginative conjunctions of my portrait placed in front of obvious facades referencing Lucknow's striking architectural heritage in ways that did little or nothing to illuminate the history and traditions they embodied or the sentiments that might be attached to them. Strikingly different was one of the images produced by the aforementioned student photo service. The process of having my portrait made had already alerted me to the distinctiveness of their approach. Baba, the photographer, took great care in posing me and directing my line of vision to his raised finger, held on either side of his camera, and sculpted my hand gestures in what I understood to be an archetypal Sufi declaration of appreciation. Offered most commonly when listening to music, the gesture always put me in mind of Rishi Kapoor's ecstatic Qawwali performance in Amar Akbar Anthony, the Manmohan Desai 1977 film. The resulting photoshopped image was remarkable. It montaged my studio pose against the dramatic backdrop of the Rumi Darwaza at night, my upraised hands seeming to respond to and also usher forth a stream of light that burst at seemingly immense velocity from the base of this late 18th century archway adjacent to the Bara Imam Bar in the centre of old Lucknow. Maybe this was Nur, the heatless light of Allah. That light was, of course, the effect of innumerable car headlights captured on a slow exposure. I would later see this visual appearance mirrored in a series of street advertisements in the same part of town, advertising Vodafone's 4G services, the river of light materializing the unimaginable speed of data transmission. Both these images involving the Rumi Darwaza, Babas, and the Vodafone advertisement seem to materialize light as an effect of speed, of vision, and information as mobile and unstoppable. That Sufi gesture also invoked memories of a portfolio of images that Chowk Studio had prepared in 2001 for Sonagiri Sarkar from Mandsaur, a town about 100 kilometers from Nagda Junction. Sonagiri was an aspirant healer and sage who took inspiration from the nearby shrine of Hussein Tekri at Jowra, a renowned pilgrimage centre known for its great therapeutic powers. He had met Suresh Punjabi at a function and admired his work so much that he commissioned an ambitious set of publicity images for use on large-scale flex banners and for printed mementos to be given to devotees, although the true beauty of some of them only works digitally. I think Natasha would have enjoyed that. The photographs captured Sonagiri's distinctively expressive hands in ways that I'm sure student photos Baba would have admired. The final section is called The Magical Double. Photography's duplicatory propensity is often celebrated in portraiture. Many Nagda studio wedding albums in the 1980s included double portraits of the bride and the groom. These involve printing the negative on one half of the paper and then flipping the negative so that the face of the subject is shown symmetrically, confronting itself and testifying to photography's uncanny mode of production, what Natasha termed its magical contract. The Kiran Kala Mandir studio in Bombay, active during the 1950s and 60s, specialised in mirror montages. There was one on the left that seemed designed to render a woman's dress fully visible, revealing the full extent of skill in tying and wearing a sari. However, in the Kiran Kala Mandir images, the mirror does not simply duplicate, rather it provides additional iterative information that would otherwise be concealed. They bring to mind the folklorist A.K. Ramanujan's observation that, quote, mimesis is never only mimesis, for it evokes the earlier image in order to play with it and make it mean other things, making mirrors turn into windows. Or we might also say, to echo Deleuze and Derrida, and also Natasha, there is no repetition without difference. Doubling starts with the fantasy of a desirable moreness, but quickly dissolves into a destabilizing multiplicity. The cinematic notion of the double provides one pathway into this. Richard Allen, following Ashish Nandi, points to the prototype of deities who, quote, incarnate and thereby reconcile differences, and which the film star, quote, playing the double role, allegorically incarnates. Allen further suggests that the centrality of the double tradition within Bombay cinema is, quote, an expression of the mimetic textuality of Bombay cinema itself, and functions as a form of self-mimicry that allows a redemption of its products from their, quote, incipiently abject status as derivative, even degraded copies. The numerous Indian versions of the magic pot tale express the conclusion that repetition never occurs without difference, rather perfectly. One memorable version from Uttar Pradesh describes the joyful amazement of two poor farmers, Kalu and Razia, who found a large pot in their fields. Kalu dropped his tobacco pouch in it, and Razia extracted 2 pouches. So they put almost everything they had into the pot to magically double it, and were delighted with their new wealth. Then, while cooking, Razia slipped on some potatoes and fell into the pot. Kalu immediately pulled her out, but then saw a second Razia struggling to get her hands and feet out of the pot. Kalu pulled her out as well, whereupon Razia shrieked, "Where has this woman come from? Why did you pull her out? Just stuff her back in again." Kalu faced the dilemma, quote, "If we stick her back in, won't we just be making the same mistake again?" The tale ends with Kalu losing his footing and falling into the pot, so that there were 2 couples whose households were supplied through the magical properties of the pot. Quote, "The neighbours were surprised to see how wealthy Kalu and his wife had become, and they were still more bewildered to discover that next door to them were another couple resembling themselves exactly. It must be his brother," they concluded. I hope Natasha enjoyed all my stories from the bazaar, the shrine and the Nawabi court, but I think she would have enjoyed this last one most of all. It captures something of her joy in the figure of the copyist as someone swept along in the river of mimesis. For her, the copyist subverted Western hierarchical models of mimesis, being able to see it, as I quote from Mimesis Across Empires, a stream without a beginning and an end that undermines its banks and picks up speed in the middle. It captured the paradox of mimesis that so fascinated her, the fact that, as she wrote, the more it resembles, the more it differs. This is one aspect of the vertiginous dynamic which her thought and writing so brilliantly embodied. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That took us to so many different places and kind of ideas and thoughts. We have time for questions and conversation, really, so...
And do you get water if people want
yeah.
water to help yourself? Yes.
Also, if there are questions online, that feel free to put it in the chat, or thoughts are fine.
I can ask myself a question, which is that I imagine before assembling this that I would be able to counterpose my perspective with Natasha's. And as I hope I've made clear, Natasha's was a far more revolutionary, challenging, wilder, more imaginative. I mean, at heart, I'm basically a plodding empirical anthropologist who likes living in his Madhya Pradeshi village whenever he can. But I realised in assembling it that Natasha's work had infected my work so much that I couldn't really usually easily disentangle a position that was hers. So there was, so I found myself wanting to add on what would Natasha have thought, but I feel that actually in the weave and heft of the thing, she's there in, her presence is there in ways without naming it.
Yeah.
Chris, is she unique in your experience? Is she unique in your experience in having that effect on, effect on your perceptions and your understanding and your looking back at things? Have you ever experienced that sort of response to any other scholars, or does she have a very particular position with you?
Barack Obama might have said she's at the front of the queue.
Yeah.
I'm not sure she's unique. I mean,
Yeah.
she's very distinctive, and there's a quality of firstness about her work.
I think one of the things that, as you were speaking, because you talked about so many things like the magic contract of photography, but also mimesis and repetition, difference, it sort of flowed very organically. And I was wondering how that, was it conversations? How did you exchange work? Was it, will you tell her stories from Madhya Pradesh, for instance? Were you sending each other drafts and?
Yeah, we read each other's work. I didn't read the most recent book for the publisher, but I read the first two books. So it was as a colleague. I mean, it's actually kind of, now I think about it, a bit odd that the publisher sent them to someone in the same room. Anyway, it was my good fortune that they did. So I was very deeply engaging with her work. I mean, there was also a kind of common set of conversations that were multipolar, I'd say. So, my Tausig's work was very important to hers, very important to mine also. Then the kind of historical lineage of Benjamin especially, hugely important. And I think a lot of her aphoristic style derives from Benjamin. So I think my LSE, my social anthropology LSE training taught me to write in long sentences with verbs rather than aphoristic poem lists.
I guess I just wanted to say it's not a question and it's not a clear thought, but I had the luck of being supervised by both you and Natasha. I mean, mainly Natasha. And when you were talking, I was thinking, what are the strands that I took from each of you, and what is it that Natasha gave to me? I think for sure this ability or this curiosity to read everything. Not that I did it justice, but I think that's what she passed on to me. And even the books that I have from her, it's like Benjamin, and it's Bart's The Neutral, and Krista Thompson's Shine. I was just thinking of the things on my shelf. But something I guess I was wondering about, so what is it? Did she give me a way of writing or a way of reading, a set of arguments? I don't actually know what the arguments, if she did, and something I'm wondering about when I listen to your talk is like, what was politics for Natasha and maybe for you, and also in this word photo state? Because on the one hand, I've been trying to understand politics actually, or like my way of understanding it through Natasha was actually description and reading and just describing the way that the world has come to be and can be. But then there's another part of me that's like, politics should be transformational. And I guess I was just wondering if other people had thoughts on this, because I'm trying to think how I would, if I now presented Natasha with a set of arguments that I've made, because I haven't talked to her in a long time. And I guess I was just wondering a little bit about politics specifically.
Well, I think her work's explicitly political, but not in instrumental ways. I mean, she's a prime candidate for potentially being cancelled. So I mean, I think her impulses are all admirable, but I don't recall instrumental, pragmatic political discussions with her. But I think her commitment to the image as a migrant, to that nomadic quality, is, I think, profoundly political. Especially this week, which not only did I manage to get through this lecture, but it looks like the forces of evil may have peaked in this country.
We have a question from one of our online audience members, Thomas Travers, asks, do you think there were particular intellectual encounters or influences that gave Natasha her spark and her nimbleness? Her personal encounters in India and with the 18th century seem important, but were there also art historical currents she picked up on?
I can't speak about her influences. I mean, I can speak about the influence she's had. I mean, I was very struck looking in the bibliography of Tom Young's recent book, Making and Unmaking of the East India Company, and then Holly Schaffer's Grafted History. So two brilliant, and I might say brilliantly produced books from Paul Mellon Centre. You know, your average punter has one or two references in the bibliography of those books. So there's like, you know, Natasha's is kind of 6 inches. So if size is any, or length is any indication of influence, I think that says quite a lot. I mean, the thing about Natasha is I'd like to be able to offer in-depth conversations about Benjamin, which I'm sure we did have, but I remember the kind of the frivolous things. They're the things that stick in one's mind. I remember I got her when I was briefly teaching at Northwestern in Chicago. She came over to do a talk, and it became expletive-laden at the end for reasons that were, you know, in a very good-humoured way, but it completely shocked a rather prim and proper audience. There was a reference in one of the talks this afternoon to Holly Clayson, who was part of the audience, I remember. So I remember swearing Natasha. I remember organising at UCL a conversation between Will Self and Jonathan Lamb, the 18th century literary historian and author of the brilliant book Preserving the Self in the South Seas. A conversation on travel writing and travel literature. And Natasha was invited to the after-event dinner, which for fiscal reasons had to be in the fish and chip shop round the corner from Judd Street, which did turn out to have an interesting history, because apparently it's where Arthur Scargill and the NUM executive used to dine during the miners' strike, and they were bugged by MI5. So,
Good lineage.
but what I remember from that, whole event was being nabbed by Natasha outside afterwards, pointing out that, what is it called, Collins and Clark? There was a very upmarket private press bookstore that had served as the TV location, right, my walking route chain. Yes, it served as the filming location for the TV series Black Books. So she then got onto Graham Linehan, the collected works of Graham Linehan, and inevitably Father Ted. So we had 20 minutes gazing into Black Books and her giving me a rundown of all the best bits of Father Ted. And I have to say her knowledge was extensive. So I can't really comment on the serious stuff.
I think that's great.
Hi, Chris. I was struck by a phrase that you used, the magical contract of photography. And as I was kind of doing my own sort of review work, I did pick up on Natasha's often talking about enchantments and magic. And there's a brilliant article in Literature Compass, I think there's a journal about enchanted traps as well. But I was wondering that sort of where you think that her magic was placed, or where she was driving or receiving that kind of sense of the magic, particularly photography as well. I think there was something, or maybe not just photography, but reproductive images, or and what kind of magic she was drawing on, because it does seem to be a trope or a way of describing the power. She often talks about the agency, and maybe that's something again that she was connecting with your work and Tausig, and maybe an anthropological tradition as well, which allows for a magical agency of not just photography, of image making. And I wondered whether that was something that you had discussed with her, or was a kind of theme that connected you.
Well, I think there was discussion earlier about, in fact, I think Rosemary in her introductory comments spoke about the breadth of Natasha's interests, whether she was really an art historian, what other discipline she could have worked within. And I think anthropology is the obvious one. I mean, one of her earliest pieces, which became the Calcutta print chapter in Mimesis Across Empires, was published in the anthropology department journal of Material Culture. I think the title was Excess in the City. And I think she took from Tausig in particular, but from a much broader range of anthropologists, what one could call a kind of neo-animism. But I think it was a neo-animism that was tempered by Latour. I suppose one of the kind of things we used to talk about were, what's useful about neo-animism and what's silly about it. Someone had a quote from her on the screen earlier, which said, "Enough of vibrant matter." So I think that was her kind of distancing herself from the sort of Jane Bennett excessive neo-animist discourse. And I think one of the kind of things we spoke about were how Latour, among others, helps one modify the more absurd claims of neo-animism, which the danger of which involved simply generously exporting human qualities to non-humans. And I think there's one bit in Latour's We Have Never Been Modern that we both fixated on, where he talks about Boyle's air pump, and he says that it lacked will but was capable of showing. So it's not human-like. It has agency, but it lacks will. It can show. So that there's a theory of materiality in there. And I think she ran with that much more nuanced, useful. So alongside the kind of wild poetry, there's a much more considered perspective, I think. And that magical traps, I mean, she's riffing there off the anthropologist Alfred Gell, who wrote a very celebrated piece called Vogel's Net, which was basically on artworks and enchantment. And I think she liked the Kabbalistic, mystical Benjamin rather than the rational Marxist Benjamin that, obviously most of the time are intimately curled up against each other.
I think one of these is also related to, I have a big voice. Oh, it's recorded, okay. No, I was just thinking, one of the things that I've noticed about Natasha in recent years is her turn to Catholicism and the level of it. And then I thought it was actually very much part of her earlier beliefs in other kinds of mysticism and various forms, and that she actually connected the two, or the more than two, because she was, as somebody said, promiscuous with her thinking. And I sometimes would say, Natasha, but that's not, you're talking about certain issues around, you know, she became very attached to her church and all that. And she said, I don't see the difference. And it struck me that she thought about that. She thought about the shift in a way, but also something that she didn't think was as much of a shift, because for her, I think she saw through barriers. She just moved if she wanted to. And I hearing more recently about her interest in mysticism, I thought, I wonder if that Catholicism was a continuity in a different way to attach to that, or it was community-based, because she was very, very fond of her community in the church, you know, and really relied on them and did so much work for them. She did a lot of work for that church and gave money as well. So there's some way in which her thinking moves through things that we normally separate, or we normally think that, you know, there's some way in which, I like your point though about the nature of her thinking about Benjamin, because she had a very difficult relationship, right? She never really liked to have the theory thrown at her, or to have to account for it, unless she had already gone through it, you know, kind of thing. But it struck me that her thinking had moved almost to multiple types of areas that we normally don't connect as being conjoined. She found, I think, no problem with that.
Well, read the Catholicism. I think that's her cosmotheism. So you know, this is where Jan Assmann's obsession with Akhenaten is really useful. So the idea that the Mosaic distinction, the Akhenaten's counter-religion, monotheism, attempted monotheism, is fundamentally different. That's what signals a break in traditions of cosmotheism, which are intrinsically polytheistic, promiscuous, intertranslatable. So the Assmann's model of cosmotheism is basically to say that prior to the counter-religion moment, everyone understood that they had their own version of basically the same thing. So there was translatability, overlap, interoperability. So I think, you know, it's Catholicism, presumably it was the polytheism of Catholicism. I'm blanking on the name of that famous book on religion in Naples, which basically argues that, you know, it's saints that are as important as Christ or the Pope. It's like Alan Danilou's Hindu polytheism. So I think, you know, that's an easy transition. And, you know, I can think of several great scholars of Hindu polytheism who had Catholic convent educations.
That's very interesting.
No, it's very good. I mean, we have time for conversation with a glass of something as well. So if we wanted to continue, or is that okay? So we want to say a very, very big thank you to Chris Pinney.